Welcome to the Center for Humanities seminar series. I'm really pleased to welcome Matthew Salises, who's going to speak to us about his memoir, To Grieve is to Carry Another Time. Matthew, over to you. Thanks.
So the memoir comes out in December. I'm going to read from the second chapter, Called Another Time, and you'll hear the numbers starting with 13. This is the first time I've read from this. 13. In 2018, after my first wife, Catherine, died from cancer, I read book after book about time. Theoretical physics, parallel universes, evolution, time travel, climate change, time on a non-human scale. It took me a while to realize that I was looking for one to tell me how to go back to when Catherine was alive. I was trying to read between the lines. In The Order of Time, physicist Carlo Rovelli describes time not as linear, but as a gravitational field. Like everything else in the universe, he claims, time is made up of extremely tiny particles. The evidence is that the closer we get to a gravitational mass, the more quickly time passes. If, for example, twins separated at birth are raised one on a mountain and one in a valley, in old age, the twin on the mountain will have aged less. She will be visibly younger. Or, for the science fiction fans, if we could really send travelers into space, upon their return, they would find that on Earth, several generations had passed, and everyone they used to know is dead. Time is no past or future, we only experience it that way. But if linearity is a perception, why can't I change times by changing how I perceive? The culprit, Rovelli suggests, is thermodynamics. At least in our human pocket of the universe, entropy never decreases, only increases. Thus, time flows one way. As a consolation for would-be time travelers, he offers the time machine of the mind, of memory. It's a disappointing compromise. In Grief, memory is not time travel, it's a one-way mirror, a transparent yet impassable border between the you that you are now and the you can only remember. Memory doesn't change time. It reminds you that time has changed and that you can never change it back. 14. As an adoptee, I grew up with grief as another time. I lived simultaneously in one reality in which I was American and another in which I was still Korean. Complete strangers would remind me I was living a borrowed life. There's no effective difference between go back to your country and be grateful that you were adopted. The difference that both insist on is the difference between how much of your life is yours and how much of your life belongs to someone else. In a Korean folktale, a tiger devours a grandmother and then impersonates her to try to trick her grandkids. The children, fleeing in the dark, pray to the heavens to save them. If the gods mean for them to live, they pray, let them send down a rope. If the gods mean for them to die, send a rotten rope. A rope appears, and the children climb up safely. The tiger, following, also prays, but knowing that she has sinned, she bets against herself. If the gods mean for her to live, let them send down the rotten rope. Again a rope appears. The tiger climbs, but the rope frays. The tiger plummets to his death. We are supposed to believe that the gods have meant to save her. If I held a rope as a child, I didn't know which one it was. What would it mean to be saved? Often I felt like the tiger, like I had devoured one country and was trying to trick the other. If my life wasn't mine, then whose was it? To whom did my prayers belong? One possible answer, the one people were always giving me then, was my adoptive parents. That or, I suppose, America. Give me back, I sometimes said, in so many words, give me back myself. I must have believed that by marrying a Korean woman, I'd gotten back what I had lost. 15. According to my adoption file, which Catherine eventually helped me find, I was left under an overpass in an insole with a note and some medication. An orphanage worker found me there. A coincidence that strains belief. I almost typed relief. Many files from my time were fabricated, but who knows? It is possible that the worker often took that route under the overpass. It's possible that I was left there to be found. Would that make me feel less abandoned? The note recorded my birthday and the hope that I be raised by someone who could take care of me. Someone rich, as Catherine translated. A policeman gave me a name. My official family register lists me as the first and only Suh in my line of Suhs. At 2.5, I was sent to a white couple in northeastern Connecticut. The story I remember being told as a kid was that my birth mother was probably a prostitute, and if not for my adoption, I would probably be a prostitute too. I don't remember who told me this. I doubt it was my parents. I only remember the story because I remember trying to imagine that story as my life. Not because the life of prostitution would have been better than the life that I had, but because I wanted to know what it might feel like to belong. I imagined a me whose birth family had kept him, even if it made their lives harder. In the worst fights with my adoptive parents, I would threaten to return to Korea and my real family. What I wanted was reassurance that I had one. Instead, my parents would tell me to try it, to go. They knew I could not. I had no idea who or where my birth parents were, or even how to speak to them. 16. Catherine died from metastatic stomach cancer at the age of 39. By the lunar calendar, she died exactly on her 40th birthday. In Korea, years that end in 9 are dangerous. The end of a decade invites death. Her mother believed that Catherine's body had waited for her birthday to end back at the beginning. She died in the early hours of morning after being revived from a heart attack. She died in Korea, where her citizenship provided better health insurance, free, than I could afford in America. In the weeks before she died, I watched whatever we call the soul visibly leave her. Her skin thinned and whitened, the energy drained from her eyes. When she died, her skin was so thin, it was almost translucent, almost already ghost. Just after she died, I held her lifeless hand and thought, let me go back just 1 minute. I thought, don't leave me, stay. To touch her still body, completely altered and yet barely changed, was to be aware that a moment is all that stands between life and death. Time is distance. Life felt nearby. It seemed as if the only reason I couldn't bring her back was I didn't know where time was. 17. When his mother died, philosopher Roland Barthes had the same feeling. Nothing any longer, he wrote in his morning diary, separates me from death except time. 18. According to Sigmund Freud, grief takes the form either of healthy mourning or of neurotic melancholy. The difference between the two is memory, which is to say, desire. The mourner learns to stop wanting their lost beloved. They choose to remember rather than to relive. The melancholic continues to want. They refuse to put their memory in time, because to make loss linear is to make it permanent. To remember a loved one isn't inherently painful. It hurts when memory is all you have. What the melancholic hates most about memory is that it happens twice. First, you remember the time that you have lost, then you remember that you have lost it. To return to your present is to return to a time in which you no longer want to live. You become a ghost haunting your own life. After Catherine's funeral, I would often play with our kids in the apartment we had rented down the street from my in-laws, and as I held them, I would feel my wife's presence in the other room, where she would have been watching us, struggling to breathe. I would be about to call out to her when I remember who I was now. What I mean is, I didn't remember that she was dead. I remembered that I was alone. My past no longer seemed to lead to my present. My life had been thrown out of time. How could I have become the sole parent of 2 children in a country in which I didn't speak the language? I couldn't imagine choosing that, yet that was what I was. 19. The feeling that your life is not your life is the premise of many stories. Total Recall, The Echo Maker, my own novel, Disappear, Doppelganger, Disappear, in which the narrator believes he's disappearing until he discovers that someone exactly like him really has disappeared. In Tomoyuki Hoshino's Me, the narrator picks up a lost cell phone and pretends to be its owner. And when he gets home, his parents no longer recognize him, and there is someone else in his place, another me. He has no choice but to accept the identity that at first he just pretended. If you can't be yourself, you still have to be someone. The belief that a loved one has been replaced by an imposter is called Capgras delusion. It was first identified in 1923 when a psychiatric patient claimed her husband and children were the object of substitutions. In Me, the narrator eventually meets dozens of his doppelgangers. Yet when he is most surrounded by himself, he feels as if he, quote, no longer knows a single human being. In our quantum world, it may be a natural leap from Capgras to parallel universes. A leap from one person who is both themselves and not themselves to a world that is both itself and not itself. If you've lost your reality, the multiverse offers a tidy solution. It is full of other lives, other possible times. What interests me most about Capgras, though, is that it is somehow about love. We recognize people not only by their faces, but also by the feelings we associate with them. In fact, even if you lose your memory, you might retain your emotional attachments. In one famous case, a patient who couldn't make memories due to a head trauma favored the same caregiver over and over, though he had no idea who she was. He couldn't recall anything about their interactions except the feelings that he had developed. His feelings were the only proof that the time that had happened to her had also happened to him. In Capgras, it is rare that the objects of substitution are acquaintances. They are almost always beloveds. In the 90s, a group of psychologists theorized that Capgras might be the result of a person recognizing a face without feeling the love the face normally evokes. Love is how you know you are in the right time. 20. When your beloved dies, people will tell you to put your faith in time, even more often than they will tell you to put your faith in faith. Time is the faith to which other faiths surrender. Even in French, it seems, time heals. In his morning diary, Bart writes, "It is said that time soothes mourning. No, time makes nothing happen. It merely makes the emotivity of mourning pass." After Bart's mother dies, time doesn't lessen his suffering. He insists on the word suffering instead of the word grief. Time simply takes him temporarily out of the moment. Whenever he is next reminded of his mother's death, the suffering returns as is. Philosophers, they're just like us. He suffers less, he implies. He suffers less, he implies, if he remains close to his mother's time. As long as he stays in the apartment they shared, other people's time stays outside. If he travels, the desire to go back overwhelms him. It is overwhelming because going back doesn't mean back to his apartment, but back to his time, the time with his mother in it. To step outside is to face the task of having to convince himself that his mother will not be waiting for him when he returns. Of course, that is exactly what the mourner is supposed to do. Convince themselves that other people's time is also theirs. Time is as controlling as any other faith. What melancholy offers is the possibility of resistance, of insisting on the world that should be rather than the world that is. 21. It's cold. Like a mirror to Capgras delusion, imposter syndrome is the feeling that everyone else thinks that you do not belong in their reality. They don't believe that you've been replaced, only that you are unworthy of them. In imposter syndrome, the subject is the one whose identity is destabilized, the one unrecognized by love in the wrong time. When I used to teach Asian American studies, imposter syndrome came up often. Many Asian American students believed that they had to prove themselves to their parents, to their communities, to the other kids on their teams, which sometimes made them try twice as hard and sometimes made them give up. If an Asian American kid is supposed to get perfect grades, for example, it becomes a failure of self to get a B. I was a quiet Asian kid because Asians were supposed to be quiet. Though at other times, because Asians were supposed to be quiet, I grew loud. You build the story of who you are around the story of who you are supposed to be. A story isn't about accuracy or even consistency. It's about value. If an object loses its value, as in Capgras, or if it takes on a different value, like a swastika in a Buddhist temple, then recognizing it can be difficult. Its being doesn't match its appearance. It is out of time. As a boy, I was always trying to prove to people that I was real, which to me meant escaping their questions about who I was and where I was from. I wanted to join their reality, even if that meant giving up on my own. After all, I had already lost my reality once. So, writes theorist Lauren Berlant, the story of your life becomes the story of the detours your desire takes. I'm just like my family. I'm just like you. Or sometimes, I'm not like them. Not like the kids who really don't belong. Bullies would pull at their eyes and chant Chinese, Japanese, Korean, as if I was supposed to choose which slant was mine. When I was out with my parents, strangers stared. I felt that I had let my parents down. They believed that we were alike, so it must be my fault if anyone did not. Do you know who your real parents are? People asked me. Sometimes my father would head someone off by saying loudly that of course I was his real kid. Didn't they see the resemblance? Maybe he too felt people wondering whether he had kidnapped me. Sometimes a stranger would look at me a little too long, as if to give me the chance to save myself, to cry for help. Then I would say that I was adopted, and the person whom I had to be saved from was myself. 22. In the documentary In the Matter of Cha Jung-hee, adoptee filmmaker Diane Bourche Lim recounts not one but 2 times that her identity was swapped for another. The first was when she became Cha Jung-hee, which was the name of the child her parents thought they were adopting. Before the adoption, Cha, the real Cha, was reclaimed from the orphanage. So the adoption agency sent Liam as her. The second time was when Liam/Cha became Diane Bourche, the American daughter of her American parents. The 2 swaps were sequential, the first responsible for the second. Likewise, as soon as Liam discovers that she was not originally Cha Jung-hee, she goes looking for the second time that she stopped being herself. She searches through her father's old home videos for the exact scene in which she says she loses her Korean self. Liam was adopted when she was 8. At 8, she would have known that she wasn't Cha. The agency sent her anyway, either not caring whether her adoptive parents found out about the swap or not believing that her parents would care. Or not believing that her parents would care. Why didn't Liam tell them who she was? Maybe she didn't believe they would care either. Or maybe she was even more afraid of being sent back to Korea, sent back to her actual life. I was 2 when I was found, if that is what actually happened, and I was sent to America weeks later. For years, I misremember that timing. I thought I'd been abandoned as a baby and spent 2 years in the orphanage. That story seemed to make more sense than my birth family keeping me for 2 years and then, once they knew me, giving me up. If I was 2 and a policeman named me, why didn't I tell him who I was? Why did I accept a new identity and then another new identity? Like Liam, I would have known I was someone else. When I arrived in America, my adoptive parents have told me I was so sick that I couldn't walk. I almost died from hepatitis and some other disease. At 2, I would have recognized the person who had abandoned me. I would have been able to call out to them, to beg them to come back. If my birth family really did raise me for 2 years before changing their minds, maybe they chose that day to leave me because I was too sick to chase them. I imagine that Liam's American identity overwrote the first 2, that to be an American daughter, she had to stop thinking of herself as Liam or as Cha. She had to adopt the gaze of her American parents, for whom the difference between Liam and Cha hardly mattered. To her adoptive parents, the real difference was the difference between Bourche and not Bourche. Not Bourche may as well have been no one or anyone. 23. The term racial melancholy, like Freudian melancholy, describes the continued desire for something permanently missing. For example, racial equality in a fundamentally racist world. Quote, the education of racism, writes scholar Anne Anlin Chang in The Melancholy of Race, is an education of desire. End quote. Yet it would be a failure to call racial melancholy pathological, as if it is an unhealthy alternative to racial mourning. Melancholy is a structural consequence of race. To fight for equal rights or the end of genocide in our unequal, genocidal world isn't pathological, it's a moral choice. You can't opt out of the world, and opting out of desire is one definition of depression. Melancholy is an attempt to avoid compounding loss, to prevent the loss of what you want from becoming the loss of wanting it. For a Korean adoptee, racial melancholy can be the desire for one's Korean self, in addition to what can sometimes seem a desire to be white, to be like one's parents. Adoption, like race, forces people into a melancholic position. In the book On Wanting to Change, psychoanalyst Adam Phillips writes that whenever we change, it is either by changing the object of our desire or by recovering that object. Which is why conversion stories, he says, like those of St. Paul and St. Augustine, so appeal to us. They imply that there is a better and realer life that we are missing out on, and that all we need to do to be better and realer is to recover it. Adoption, then, is a melancholic conversion, in that it converts the adoptee not to a life that they believe that they are missing out on, but to a life that someone else believes they're missing out on, the adoptive parent. Since the adoptee is the object of their parents' desire, the conversion can never satisfy them. On the contrary, the life that the adoptee ends up missing out on is the life they were converted from. 24. The parts of ourselves that we do not seem to recognize as ours fall under what Freud calls the uncanny. He gives the example of a train ride during which he is shocked to find another person in his car until he recognizes his own reflection. As a boy, I had the opposite experience. It comforted me to imagine someone else and shocked me to recognize myself. Because my parents insisted I was just like them, to look in the mirror was to look for someone who belonged in my life. To look in the mirror and see a Korean, that was what took me by surprise. Uncanny is what scholar David L. Eng and psychoanalyst Shin-Hee Han call the immigrant experience, especially for Asian Americans, in an essay in the anthology Loss. They tell the story of one of Han's analysans, a Japanese American mocked for his pronunciation of English. His pronunciation is his mother's pronunciation. What used to be a source of safety and comfort, his mother and his mother tongue, now becomes a source of shame. What was home is now unheimlich. If there's a reason that I'm writing this book, it is because grief makes time, which is to say the organization of the self, through progress myths like romance, capitalism, social mobility, belonging, uncanny. To grieve is to feel that you are in the wrong time. The same is true of love. In love, you want time to stop being time. You want the moment to go on forever. Grief is love, some people say. If that is true, it is because both make linearity an unacceptable loss. If that is true, it is because both make linearity an acceptable loss. In the uncanniness of splitting the time that you want to be in, from the time you are already leaving that desired time behind, the now becomes the fulcrum between who you want to be and who you can bear to lose. 25. In 1995, when Chung-Rae Lee's landmark novel Native Speaker was published, some white critics accused it of an identity conflict. The novel is half spy thriller, half family drama. Its protagonist, Henry Park, is a corporate spy grieving the loss of his son. At the beginning of the book, his white wife flees to Europe to find herself by sleeping with a white man, leaving Park with a list of accusations that includes illegal alien, emotional alien, yellow peril, and traitor. Since its publication, Asian American critics have rescued the split nature of native speaker as a representation of the split that Asian Americans feel between successful model minority on the one hand and constant victim of racism on the other. Quote, "This is the challenge for us Asians in America," says one of Lee's characters. "How do you say no to what seems like a compliment? From the very start, we don't wish to be rude or inconsiderate, so we stay silent in our guises." End quote. Asia is the ghost in the American machine. Asia is the America that Columbus thought he had found. The very first Americans were likely Asians who crossed the land bridge during the last ice age. The first Chinese and Indians in America arrived as replacements for slaves, writes journalist and activist Helen Zia. In 1806, using the same ships that brought slaves from Africa, the flesh merchants indentured coolie labor from China and India to perform the same work under the same conditions. Chinese Americans built the Transcontinental Railroad, then were left out of the photo commemorating the final spike. In the years that followed, so many were shot, lynched, raped, beaten, and stolen from that the period became known as the driving out time. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act became the first law in U.S. history to name the exclusion of a single ethnic group. Laws in 1907, 1924, and 1934 excluded Koreans, Japanese and Indians, and Filipinos, respectively. In 1922, a Japanese American Supreme Court case established the term Caucasian, that's where it comes from, which was named as a requirement for naturalization. In 1923, when an Indian American challenged that requirement, since Indians are technically Caucasian, Caucasian was officially changed to white. That's where white comes from. My own arrival in America can be traced back to the Korean War, after which a white couple started the international adoption industry by adopting 8 half-Korean children left behind by American GIs. 26. At 23, for the first time since my adoption, I went back to Korea to teach in an English language kindergarten. Having grown up in Connecticut, I had no exposure to Korean culture. I never eaten Korean food, never watched a Korean film, never even heard of K-pop. It was 2005, and kimchi was not yet popular in the States. The LG chocolate phone, which was the first Korean product that most people probably ever recognized, wouldn't arrive until the following year. My only knowledge of Korea was my body, and I only knew that my body was Korean because my parents had said so. In other words, I was completely unprepared for what I would find. I had the romantic idea that I would find myself. I flew in just before Chuseok, which is the biggest holiday of the year, and when everything shut down for days, I had no idea why. The housing the school had promised me was already occupied. The manager put me in a love motel instead. I didn't know what a love motel was. I lay on my round bed under neon red lights that never turned off, and when I switched on the TV, I found only 2 channels, both softcore porn. When I got hungry, I walked to a 24-hour convenience store and bought the only products that I recognized: a box of Frosted Flakes and a carton of milk. I had no dishes or utensils, so I mixed them in my mouth. It seemed clear at last that my American life was the only life. I made plans to fly back, to give up on whatever I was looking for before I even knew what that was. And then I showed up for my first day of work and met Catherine. For 13 years, being with Catherine seemed to make my 2 times 1. Together, we lived a Korean-American life. And when Catherine died, that shared time became the time that I carried. In my dreams, I would go to it. Instead of a time that never existed, instead of Catherine being cured or never having cancer, I would dream that she was still in Korea, still getting treatment, that our time had just simply continued on. For a while, she would visit me like that almost every night. I would visit her, though now those dreams are rare. Before I remarried, I'd wake up confused and alone, soaked in sweat, desperate to return. I would try to memorize every detail of our life in that other world. For as long as I could, I would hold on to the time that I carried until the time that I was in would pull me out. And then I would tell myself that she was gone and that my life must go on alone. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very powerful. I'm sure we've got lots of questions and feedback to come. We have a mixed audience today. So what I'm going to suggest is we alternate one question in the room and then one question over Zoom. I'll do my best to keep track of whose turn it is to ask a question. If you're in Zoom, if you could just raise your hands using the raise hands feature. If you're in the room, do the equivalent in real life. And if you could speak into the microphone, I'm going to call on you all to help me make sure the microphones get to the right places when people have questions. One final note is that the book, To Grieve is to Carry Another Time, will be published in December, in case any of you are wondering when you can read the rest of it. Who wants to start with a question? Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the process of writing this, since it is a braided narrative, and a braided narrative kind of necessitates for the writer to be in the present and outside and anticipating reader reaction, all that kind of stuff too.
Yeah, so I sold the book actually as an essay collection. And what we had done was just like ordered the essays chronologically from when I'd written them. And so it was supposed to show some kind of growth as a person, as a writer. But then when I got edits back from my editor, I thought, I don't know, I don't want this to be a book. I already sold it twice at 2 different places, so I was a little worried about it. But I told her I would just make it into an actual memoir. And so then it bought me like another year and a half. So there's a tip if you need more time. Just say you're writing something totally different. But what I had was just, maybe 500, 600 pages of essays. And so I just cut them all up. I actually first went through and tried to take out any part that might seem like a part of a narrative, a cohesive narrative. And then I printed it all out and cut it all up section by section and laid it out on my office floor under different categories. And then all I had to do was put it together, which was not very easy for sure. I had a few different configurations going, but eventually I settled on this kind of braided or numbered lyric essay-ish form, which allowed me then to kind of pull from these various different things that I was thinking about, right, like race, adoption, parenting, grief, love, desire as a kind of concept and theory, and then smush them all together, which for me, I always think the thing that holds any essay together is just that they're everything is held by the author, right? So like those things all make sense to me as one thing, but I had to kind of try to make them, or try to prove that they would make sense to somebody else.
Any other questions in the room? I don't see anyone signed up on Zoom yet. Well, preemptively, I'm going to hand the microphone to Paige. Not for you to ask a question, but just if someone on this side of the room asks one, you can pass the microphone down.
Oh, is it on? Hello? Okay.
Oh, you do have a question. That's
I do actually.
You
Yes,
just forced it out of.
I was trying to formulate while there was silence. But yes. Thank you for sharing. I was really curious about how you wove in psychology into your work and how that played a role, both the historic part and current research. And I wanted to also, I forgot what the type of, it was cap something?
Capgrass.
Capgrass, that's how you pronounce it? Okay, I wanted you to repeat that because I couldn't remember. So I wanted to, yeah, how did you weave in psychology into your work?
Yeah, great question. While Catherine was getting cancer treatments, I spent a lot of time just kind of sitting in the ward, which was always very hot, right? Because the cancer patients get really cold, while she was sleeping, right? Like she would get the treatment and it was really painful, and the best thing for her was just to try to sleep through it. And so I just had a lot of time there to be with my own thoughts and anticipate the grief that was coming. And I ended up reading a lot of novels, but also a lot of psychoanalysis, a lot of like consciousness stuff. And by the time she had died, she actually got more and more Christian, and I was reading these books, and by the time she died, I'd convinced myself that that consciousness is just a kind of like byproduct of the mind. But then she died, right? And it was really this. I mean, I don't know how many people like see a person just die in front of them. Hopefully, not that many. But it's really like something just leaves them, right? Like, and I could see it kind of like moving out of her. Right? Like she got, obviously like skinnier and more bony and lost a lot of weight, but also there was like, a, I don't know, some kind of thing that left her. And so when I was trying to, write about it a few years later, I was kind of looking at all these things about time, and they seemed also to be tied into things about consciousness and psychology, psychoanalysis. All of that stuff seemed very close together for me. And I had done some work and thought about racial melancholy a lot, and I knew I had wanted to write about that as another form of grief. And so that also kind of just led directly into kind of psychoanalytic theory.
Thank you.
Oh, there is a hand up on Zoom. Sorry, I missed that. Okay, I invite William Shaw, if you can hear me without the microphone.
Hello.
Okay.
Oh dear, that's quite dystopian. I'm interested. Obviously, you refer to a lot of other work in the course of what you just read. I'm curious. Are there any other books, or particularly any other memoirs, you view this project as being in conversation with, and how does the sort of the cut up, or like the reworking of previous material, sort of feed into that?
Yeah, great. I had this kind of surreal experience recently where I don't understand why, but epigraphs don't count as fair use. And so you have to get permission for your epigraphs. And I have two. One is from maybe like the first Korean adoptee memoirist, at least the first that I read, Jane Jung Trenka. and I had some contact with her, so I was able to ask her without it feeling too weird. But the other is from Judith Butler. So I had this weird experience of having to ask Judith Butler permission to use their words as an epigraph. And actually, it was amazing. They just like wrote back in like 15 minutes and was like, "Great, do it. Good luck." Which, you know, I guess just a sign of kind of the generosity there. But so I think of the book kind of like directly in conversation with those two books. The Butler book is Precarious Life, and the Trenka book is The Language of Blood, I think, or maybe Fugitive Visions. And so those things were kind of constantly playing in the background of the book, right? One about kind of the psychoanalytic idea of grief and love and desire, and one about, you know, adoption as an industry, adoption as a story, adoption as a experience, adoption as a trauma, throughout the book. And the other things were, you know, for me, like the kind of essays that I like are kind of like collecting. It's like a raven or something, right? Like you go in the nest and you see all of these weird trinkets that they've stolen from all these places they've been. And the only thing that ties them together is this one raven's journey. And so I like seeing essays that show kind of like all the thinking behind the thinking. And I think that's, you know, like with any book, right? There are all these other books behind the book, or the book that the book is in conversation with. And so a lot of those ended up, right, like Asian American literature, psychoanalytic theory, right, like even just books kind of about grief and grieving, about neuroscience, all just kind of are parts of those things that the Raven has collected.
I sense the question in the very back there.
Hi. I just wanted to ask about what it was like building up to writing a memoir as opposed to fiction, and especially with such a hard topic. Like, how was it confronting the fact that you were really going to write about something on a very opaque level?
Yeah, don't do it. It was definitely not. It was not easy, and it really was a disruption in my mental and emotional health. And I thought it wouldn't be that bad, right? Because a lot of it is cut from essays and kind of reworked material from essays that I had already thought a lot about and written and published. But it's very different, yeah. It's very different from an essay. There's a way in which an essay, you can kind of like hold on to just a piece, right? And then let it go once you've finished it. But the memoir, I mean, like a novel is just, it's all the things, right? All the satellites. And it was hard. It was hard. I'd much rather write novels. Not that novels aren't hard. They're very, very hard. Actually, in some ways, I feel like much harder, but less hard on your emotional well-being. Yeah.
Hi. I'm curious how the experience of this grief that happened later in your life with your wife dying, like how that, or like if it changed the way that you thought of or processed this grief that happened like throughout your childhood, especially something that happened when, you know, you were really young and maybe didn't have like the language as a 2-year-old to kind of process those things.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, that's really part of what made it so hard for me was, you know, all of those things got kind of tied up together, and I had felt somehow as if they were like at least slightly resolved by being married to somebody Korean, having Korean American kids, being kind of like very much kind of like in a culture that had its foot in both doors. And then it was like I lost all of, like everything all over again. Yeah, I guess that's what I would say is it all just got stuck together. And the way the trauma does, right? Like it's like a lint ball or something, right? Like it just sucks all the other lint up, and then what you've got is something that burns your house down.
When you had put together those essays, had the essays like emerged out of like other projects, or were they all like individual things, or had you like expected to make something larger of them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I try to think of like anything, for the creative writing grad students, anything that I'm working on as eventually part of a book, right? Like, especially if you end up in academia, but just like career-wise, the books are really the thing that have the impact, and then also the reach. And so whenever I'm working on anything, I start to think, will this ever become a book? Because if not, then I should probably just work on something else. So there was a part of me that was thinking at some point, this will be material for an essay collection or a memoir or something. But they all kind of came up individually on their own over, I don't know, like 12, 13 years or something, 14, 15 years now maybe. And so they were all kind of like had their own self-contained subject, but like everything, right? I think those containers were just arbitrary containers, and so they all had a larger container as well. They all fit in a larger container as well. Does that answer that question? I feel like I left a part of it out.
I think that was the answer.
Okay.
The answer. Don't see anyone on Zoom. Oh, we have a question right here.
So in my master's program, we talked about your book, Craft in the Real World, a lot, which is focused on fiction, craft, obviously. But in writing this memoir, did you see a connection between nonfiction craft and fiction craft, and what does that look like for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of similarities, right? Just kind of like you're still dealing with stories in a way, and the way that you tell the story of the self, is also kind of partly how you tell the story of anything. And in the Craft of the Real World, a lot of that kind of came from having this very fractured story of the self, right? And then trying to like put it into a very streamlined kind of narrative that didn't seem to make sense to me and the way that I had lived or been forced to live my life. But what I guess what I like about nonfiction usually is the things that I feel most interested in, kind of like structures and individual stories and ideas and interactions, are all there in nonfiction. And the things that I dislike the most about fiction, which is usually like creating characters, which for me is very difficult. They come out first like little stick figures, and it takes years to like add the flesh on. But in nonfiction, they're just people right? Like you're just using actual people, and people can't say like that's unbelievable because it's just what happened, right? The hard thing about fiction sometimes is like making a kind of sense of something that in life only makes sense because it's real life, and our lives make no effing sense, right? So that's what I guess how I see the kind of similarities. But I also think like the end of an essay doesn't really have to be a kind of like story end, right? So like as you're moving through an arc or some kind of movement in an essay, right? Like, I think in fiction, there's some way in which the story, the character is always part of that movement, but in nonfiction, it doesn't necessarily have to be.
I'm going to take the last question for myself, if that's all right. You said some really amazing, profound things about time in the reading. And I'm curious, is that a theme you were interested in before your wife's death, or was it really after her death that these thoughts about time became central to you?
Yeah, it's a great question. It was only afterwards. Actually, I've never kind of thought of it before, but yes, it was only afterwards. It really did feel like, and I've had this feeling also with other kind of times where I feel a lot of like I did or chose the wrong thing or something, and I should have chosen some other thing, but that like the other option is just so close. It's like on the other side of the wall, and if only I could just like step through the wall, I would have been in the better timeline. And so that feeling has always kind of been a part of my life, but really like the research into time, that all came really directly afterwards. And it's still ongoing. I mean, I think it's so fascinating. Maybe I should have been more interested in it beforehand, but it is really, it's all very, very interesting.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
This has been a really, really thought-provoking and deep hour that we've spent together, so thank you very much. And one note about next week's presentation is that even though we always meet at 12:15 for the Center for Humanities seminar, next week we're actually going to meet at noon because the presenter, Mercy Corredor from the philosophy department, has a class right after, so she's going to start her presentation at noon. Hopefully, those of you who are used to coming along each week will remember next week that it's slightly different. I'll follow up with an email as well, but just wanted to highlight that today. The other thing I want to highlight is that we have got at the Center for Humanities a monthly writing retreat, which is the first Friday of every month. So that's coming up at the end of this week, 9:30 to 11:30. This time we're going to meet in the Liberal Arts and Human Sciences building basement conference room. So it's 005. We'll have some coffee and goodies. So please join us there. If you get the chance to RSVP through the link on our website, that would be great, just so we have a sense of who's coming. Even if you don't, feel free to show up. The idea is that we just get together, we write in community, and get the chance to have a few minutes of conversation as well. So hope to see you at one or both of those upcoming Center for Humanities events. For now, let's give a round of applause to our speaker for the presentation today. Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Thanks, Paul.
And thanks everyone for joining us. See you next time.